Hi, everybody. You've already learned about while loops, and I want to show you a different type of loop that can make your lives a little bit easier. As you see here on the screen, I've got myself a while loop that, it's got the counter here, and then here's the condition for the counter, and then we increment the counter down inside the code itself. That works just fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but use a for loop instead of a while loop, the code's a lot cleaner and it's easier to kind of debug because everything's in one place. And it's really what for loops are meant for. For loops are meant for, are used when we want to repeat something a certain number of times. Usually with a while loop, you only use it when you're not really sure how many times it's going to run. In other words, you run until a condition becomes false. Like, if somebody is playing a game and you ask them if they want to continue, they hit yes until they change their mind and then they hit no and then you exit out. Um, it's also good if you care about multiple conditions. For loops are really good for looping when you have a specific number of loops you want to run through. Like, you're going to run it 5 times, or you're going to run it n number of times, whatever the user specifies. Like with the gambling program that I had some of you guys write last time. It's also good for looping through an array, but that's something that we'll cover next time when we do arrays. In the meantime, you see all of this here in this while loop, all of this trouble that you have to go through to set up a while loop. For loop, similar structure. You've got for and then, parentheses, and then you type your stuff in it. However, you put all of the stuff into your parentheses. So for instance, you create a counter. So right here, let's actually call it counter 2 so it doesn't interfere with the other counter. I say, here's my counter. It's an integer and it equals 0, so I initialize it right here inside the setup for the loop. And then I'm going to give it the condition. So counter 2 is less than 6, another semicolon. And then I say counter plus plus. So in here, I create the counter variable. I initialize it. I say it's set to 0. I create the condition for when the loop will end. It'll end when once it equals 6. And then I increment my counter. Now, if I wanted it to increment by 3 instead of by 1, I would do plus equals 3. Or, if I wanted to increment it by 5, equals 5. But right now, I just wanted to increment by 1. Notice that I don't put a semicolon after this last one. Only the first two conditions, the first two parts have a semicolon after them. So now I've got my for loop all set up, and all I have to do is type this out, counter 2, right? And then I'm done. Let me comment out this code so that you can see what happens when just the for loop runs. Oop, I have an error somewhere. I put counter instead of counter 2. So now you can see here's my output. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once it gets up to 6, the loop comes. It increments by 1 every time. So you can see how this might be easier. Like if you create this counter variable for the while loop, it might not appear right next to your while. And this counter increment also might occur further down your code. If you've got a more complicated bit of code, then you probably, it'll be harder to find the various parts of the code that's used just for looping. With your for loop, it is all in one place. So that's pretty nifty. For loops are also great for doing stuff where you have nested loops. For instance, you've got a loop within a loop. And I'll give you an example that you could have used for one of the extension problems for challenge 3. Let's say we've got for int counter equals 0, counter less than height minus 2, counter plus plus. I'll say height equals, right, 5 and int 5, right? So here's the beginning of my loop, and it's out, and I'm just going to print f. It's a string without a character turn at the end, and I think print does the same thing. So if you don't want to go to the next line when you print something out, you use print instead of print line, and then it'll print them all side by side. So now I will create my for loop. I've got another loop here, int counter 2 equals 0, and then counter 2 less than width minus 2, and then counter 2, and I will set out, and then print, and then side here, I will set out a star. There you go. So what this should do is this should print, it should go through this loop and it should say, okay, is height less than or equal to, or is counter less than or equal to height minus 2, right? So long as the number is 0, 1, 2, or 3, or so, then it'll print a star. Then it goes into here and it checks width. All right, if counter 2 is less than width minus 2, so in other words, 0, 1, 2, or 3, then it'll print a space. So it should be star, space, space, and then when it gets to width minus 2, it exits the loop and it prints one more star, and then it starts over again, right? So let's see how this works. And there you have it. I've got star, and this is my first loop, and then the spaces are all my second loop, and then it exits and goes back to that last print line on the first loop, and then it loops over again until it equals height minus 2, and then it's done. So you can imagine there are all sorts of useful things that you can do with that. You've got the first loop doing something, and then the second loop doing a different thing, doing a different calculation, and then returning to the first loop again. It's really quite powerful. So these are two examples of for loop in action. As I said, you also want to use those for arrays, but we're not going to talk about that until we actually get to arrays. There are a series of problems that require for loops. Basically, every problem in challenge set number 4 should be solved using a for loop, not a while loop. I want you to get into the habit, into the practice of using a for loop. So this is the basic thing. It's the concept should be very similar to you. The only difficulty you might have is nested loops, but I'm confident that we'll be able to figure it out. So best of luck, guys.